Great to see you all here. And what a panel we have to discuss the transition era. I'm a historian by training, and for historians, transition era is really that time going from the medieval age into the modern era. And with the transition that we're hoping to create with the energy transition, it really does feel that we will enter a whole new historical era. So, with COP28 days away, and with all of us geared up to think about how we can solve the climate crisis, Ms. Johnson, I want to start with you. And I want to ask you how you see the transition era, what challenges it poses, but also what opportunities for investors.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Your Excellencies for the invitation here and to this successful conference, and for our first one having so many people. So it's fantastic to be here. Look, I don't know that I can define the transition era. I guess I would define it as when we finally get to net zero carbon emissions, right? So there you go. Now the challenge is the opportunities. Well, the opportunity of 90% of the world's governments say they're committed to net zero by 2050. And right now we're spending $1.1 trillion a year, and people estimate that we need to increase that by 3 times to meet that number. As an asset manager, that feels like that's an opportunity. I would say that the challenges are the reality, and I was speaking with somebody today who said they're earning 6.5% on solar projects. Well, if I can earn 5% on cash, that doesn't seem like a great investment to me. And as an asset manager and a fiduciary, we've got to weigh investment returns with also the ability to invest and to help with the climate transition. So, what do we need to do? We need to get really serious about blended finance, where you have governments working with those, both private and public capital, to come together to be able to support reasonable returns and clear policy around it, and then have incentives. So government policies that have incentives for companies to actually make the investment, as well as it's the carrot and the stick. Things like a global, carbon exchange where companies are having to pay for carbon emissions, and that there are ways to buy that. And so it gets built into the whole business model. So and then the final thing is just, there's really bad data around this. If you're investing and you can't get clear data, you're always going to look for a premium. So those are some of the challenges.
Blended finance, clear data, and as you said, reasonable returns, which is, it's a challenge because businesses are really set for making sure that they are meeting the needs of their shareholders. So, Sir Christopher, I want to turn to you. Often it's been said that the private sector hasn't been involved enough in trying to create this transition, energy transition era, but also for wider climate action. Can business and investors solve the climate crisis?
Absolutely, absolutely not without regulation and taxation from governments. We've got 40% of direct emissions coming from companies, and those emissions keep rising every year because to decarbonize industry, transport, energy, every sector of the economy, it costs money, and companies, this is the so-called green premium, and these investments will put a company at a competitive disadvantage without regulation and taxation. And that's why the solar projects Jenny mentioned aren't economic, because the polluting industries aren't being taxed. And so we will, there's a myth that somehow industry will solve the problem, and that voluntary actions will solve the problem. But it's a complete myth, and it's imperative that companies and investors push for regulation and taxation in their own long-term self-interest, and governments wake up and realize that without taxation and regulation, there will be no transition. it'll be a myth. And the acid test is emissions keep rising.
So I want to turn to you, Mr. Javid, because what we're hearing here from Sir Christopher is you need regulation and taxation. Your former position, you had to look at these details very carefully. And today, as you're advising, as you're looking at risks and what needs to happen, how do you respond to that? Do we need to have regulation and taxation as a solution?
No, I think first of all, thank you for having me. I think Sir Christopher is absolutely right in what he said, the way he's put it. In that to have that transition, particularly if we talk about the climate change and fighting that, that it does require the world over governments to be very, very involved and to drive that change, right? So whether it's, as Sir Christopher said, whether through taxation, it's subsidies, it's through regulation, and all the sort of the weapons a government would have to try and get that change. But perhaps it might be useful if I just sort of give my sort of sense on why it's so hard for governments, particularly in developed economies. In the if I look back, the UK government, I think it was the first or the second maybe to vote for net zero, right, to pass a net zero legislation in its parliament. I was there. It went through parliament. 95% of MPs voted for it, right? And the problem with this is that MPs, legislators, politicians around the world sort of saying, I support net zero and I want to see this change. They're not, this generation are not the ones that have to deliver it, or necessarily they feel sometimes wrongly, they don't have to make the hard decisions. So they sort of get the credit for the vote, but they don't actually have to have the challenge of delivering. Or they see it's in 2050, obviously it's not, but they sort of see that's a long way away. And also what's happening is that, if you go back to, we're talking about energy transition, right? So if you go back to the original sort of, if we can call it that, energy sort of revolution, when we were around the world, we started to get electricity being generated, whether it's coal-fired, gas-fired, nuclear civil power, and the networks that were created. Governments financed that. There was a lot of government involvement in that, of course, and regulation and stuff, but people could see the benefit. Right? You could, you're sitting at home, you suddenly move from gaslight, candlelight to you flick a switch and the light comes on. And people could feel the benefit. The challenge for government is that there's trillions and trillions that are required for this transition. But for a lot of governments, it's really hard to sort of get their voters, get the electorate focused on the benefits, because whether your electricity is generated by solar power or gas-fired power station, you flick the switch and the same thing happens. You don't feel the benefit. And that is why I think governments are going to have to be much more involved in this than any other transition we've seen in history.
And the issue, of course, is also about price. So where the ordinary citizen feels a difference is when prices go up and down. So at a time when people are feeling the pain, especially in more of the developed economies of inflation, it's really hard to tell them, yes, but pay more now because it will be good in the future.
That's right. And the reality is, whether it's sort of financed by the private sector or it's financed by government, at the end of the day, consumers will have to pay. And those prices, certainly to begin with, overall will be higher than otherwise. Over time, new prices can come down as you have the huge stock built and you built the distribution networks. But initially, there is a price to be paid. But the point I think politicians just need to get much better at is that if we don't do this, the price that will be paid by all of the society is a lot bigger than that.
Mr. Al-Abbar, if I can turn to you, when we look at this issue of the transition era in frontier markets, in places that could leapfrog some of those steps that we're talking about in terms of energy development, how do you see it?
First, it's interesting you talked about this will cost trillions. It's really, rings in my ears. And it's really interesting that if we need trillions, I think about 3.2 trillion spent on the war in Afghanistan. God knows how much money is spent somewhere else. How much money can we save to save the world by destroying the world? This is really crazy, no? And we're asking these governments to put regulation, right? Something is not right. Anyway,
How do we make it right?
let me tell you. First of all, I think the responsibility is ours all, including the audience, because we're real consumers. We just take advantage of this poor environment, you name it. But for me, as a person from the UAE, it's a little different. Because, see, we are a tribal society. We are completely different. I would say that other countries are similar to us, few. Because the way we live, what we believe in, we believe first in country. We believe in our leadership. And like many of you, we believe in family. These are very deep principles that staying with us, and I'm sure a few other countries are also, and that alters the way we think. That alters how we do business, how much we care about the environment we're in. Even though, for the past 29 years, I run a public company and I'm being slaughtered for my quarterly result. And I've been taking it for the past 29 years. I hope it doesn't show on my face, right? So still the responsibility, as we spoke earlier, I think together, is that you need to sort out the world, but we are also responsible financially to deliver certain returns. And I do agree that regulation have to come in in a systematic way so we all can behave and look after the environment. I think we as new countries, we are 40 plus years old. I think we have a much better chance at fixing this. And if you look at the UAE, and if you look at how old Masdar is, and it's one of the largest, clean energy producers. Actually, the UAE didn't have to do this because we are really sitting on the other side of the coin. But that shows you the tribal thinking that we are responsible for this world that we live in. And I feel the same way, and we are taking the subject seriously. So I hope my other organization in Abu Dhabi, Eagle Hills, that during COP will announce probably an incredible starting of first time changing the construction industry forever, where actually there is no concrete in what we are going to do. And might be totally recyclable, and it's doable. And this is where doing it. There's no regulation, there's no tax. But again, this is the tribal part of us, that we're responsible for the country, we're responsible for our society, we're responsible for our neighbors, and we'll try to do what's right.
And generational thinking.
Of course.
And so that motivator, exactly, being intergenerational thinking, but also that collective action. So, Ms. Johnson, I want to turn to you because, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which you have been very active in, how has it helped propel some of that thinking of saying, okay, we need to voluntarily come in, step up, and how can asset managers play that influential role?
Well, I mean, so what it did is I think it focused asset managers, and there was a lot of peer pressure in it. I also think that's why you saw some asset managers sign and then back away from it. As asset managers, we manage our clients' money, so we can commit to educating and bringing our clients along. But in the end, it's our clients' decision as to whether or not they support how we're thinking about investing it, which is why, and our clients, I mean, if you're a pension fund, it's pretty tough to say, listen, I invest in these things that were not returning the same amount as I could have returned with something else. But good news is you help the environment. Bad news is you don't have enough money to retire, right? I mean, you have to balance these things. This is the reality of it. And so I think what the Net Zero Initiative did is it said, asset managers, you got to be educated around it. You're going to be committed to working with clients to try to get there. And it created a focus, but it doesn't solve some of the issues that we've talked about.
Sir Christopher, I want to turn to you. What Mr. Abbar spoke about, this idea of having that moral imperative. And we were just having a conversation at the back where, we can put in regulation, we can make the business case for this. But at the end of the day, if you're not too bothered about what's going to happen in 50 to 100 years, it's really hard to move the needle.
That's right. Ultimately, climate change is a spiritual problem. If we don't care about poor people in poor countries who are suffering by not being able to grow food or dying in heat waves, or if we don't care about our children and their children, then we'll burn down the planet. And we don't have till 2050 or 2040 before we change. The next 10 years will be our last chance. And so this is a moral problem, a spiritual problem. It's actually not an economic or technological problem. We know we have the money to fix it. We spend more on wars than we need to fix it. Yep. We have the technologies, but we don't have political will, is what Sajiv said. And that's because there's a selfishness in society where rich countries are polluting and letting poor countries and rich countries and rich people are polluting, and poor countries and poor people are suffering. And the rich countries won't allow 1 billion climate migrants to come in. And so, in my opinion, this really is the heart of the matter. That before focusing on technological and financial analysis and regulation, we have to start with why. Do we care about our fellow human being, even if they're poor and live in a poor country? If we don't, then we'll continue to burn down the planet, because those are the people who are suffering today. In Africa, they're struggling to even eat one meal a day because climate change is drying out the soils. And so we really have to go inward, all of us, and ask, can each of us do our part? Because there is no one else who's going to save the planet except each of us, and care about our fellow human being.
Mr. Javid, I want to turn this conversation to you because, again, having that political will, what's the political challenge, but also the economic consequences? And if we look at the title of our session, it is about investing in the transition era. So when we look at those investments for politicians and the economic consequences in developed countries, but particularly the UK example.
Yeah, look, as we've heard, the political challenges for governments across the world are huge in delivering on climate change. Not least, it's happening, this transition, that we need to turbocharge now. It's happening in a backdrop when governments have relatively high debt because of previous crises. Obviously, interest rates are a lot higher than what we've been used to recently. Inflation is higher. And also for all governments, but particularly in developed countries, they're facing some massive demands for spending outside of this, such as demographic change, for health systems, social care systems, the defense, when the post Cold War era, conflict is back, unfortunately, and so there's costs there. And also we've seen a rise in populism the world over, and that is leading to spending promises by government after government. So when you put all that together, it just feels there's not that much money around, certainly as governments would see it. And I think that taken together is probably the biggest set of challenges, because whether it's government spending or subsidy or regulation, it will lead to extra costs for the customer, and that is what I think holds a government back. In terms of on the counter side of that, I think it's worth sort of governments doing more to illustrate the benefits that come from this beyond the obvious, which is basically, obviously, the most important thing is saving our planet. But the more immediate benefits of that huge investment, once it materializes in a country, can lead to a lot of jobs, not just in those industries, but in related industries. It can spur innovation that can lead to efficiencies and creation of new technologies and new ways of doing things beyond just trying to deal with the climate challenge, and also economic resilience. Firstly, all countries will be more economic resilient if they have mitigated some of the aspects of climate change. But also, if your energy is no longer dependent only on effectively fossil fuels, you can, in the long term, your country will be much more resilient, not having to perhaps importing a lot less and building a new skill base. So I think there are a lot of economic benefits that governments can do a lot better at articulating and taking advantage of.
Mr. Abbas.
These big, powerful countries, the trouble also is that one political party in, the next political party out. So I don't know if the world can actually organize itself because, that's the other challenge is that are these governments stable? But then again, we can't say anything because we have to believe in the democratic system. But then, one day in, one day out, and you play with the world that way. So that's a global challenge. Therefore, I really believe in what you said. We all have to be responsible to the world deep inside us. Now, how many people think this way? How many people think that way? But at the end, I think everybody should do his part.
But your point about short-termism when it comes to certain political structures and long-termism and long-term planning, that also applies to the private sector, where you have companies that are really thinking about what's my next quarter result going to look like, and where can I actually think
No,
long
I have to
term.
tell you, on the private sector, we are not doing enough. I'll be honest with you. We are not doing enough.
Sir Christopher, can I ask you, because there's another element to this. We've spoken about government, we've spoken about private sector. There's philanthropy also, and of course with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, hugely important in the projects you've done. Can you give us some of the lessons learned on the role of philanthropy?
Sure. So I've been doing climate philanthropy for 20 years. My foundation has given away over $1 billion in climate philanthropy, created many institutions around the world. We work globally. Philanthropy has a role to play in technical assistance to governments, but also political economy to make the political case. Because, as Sajid said, we see a rise not just in populism, but in the far right, who don't want to do anything to save the planet. Okay, Trump has said if he gets into power, he'll eliminate all the green policies, burn as much fossil fuels as possible. Yeah, completely irresponsible. And philanthropy has a role in communication, the media. Okay, and I would also say, also to raise ambition to governments. One of the things we do is at conferences, try and make sure there's accountability frameworks so that countries actually follow through. But I would say there's another role for philanthropy, which is to make the moral and spiritual case. I'm funding spiritual education because, as the case has been made here, if we don't get to the why, we're not going to solve it. And philanthropy can do things others can't. For example, we started a litigation hub where we fund half of all the environmental litigation in the world, with a 65% success rate. And that's not something the business is going to do. That's not something the government's going to fund. And so we need more climate philanthropy. So if there's anybody here in the audience or listening who wants to do climate philanthropy, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, on that note, I'm afraid our time on this panel has come to a close. So I will take this moment to thank our panelists. Clear call to action as we go into COP28. We all have a role to play in our different patterns and in our different roles. I'd say also it was important to hear about blended finance, because I think that's one of the opportunities that's there when we're thinking about investing. MBDs, we'll see a lot of that conversation happening in only a few days' time in Dubai. So for now, I'd like to thank the panel and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.